Hello. Yep. There we go. Good. Okay. Sorry about the delay, folks. A few technical difficulties. I hope you're enjoying the festival, the conference thus far. We're in the final stretch, and I'm very happy that you're here to join my talk. And I'm going to be talking about Zap. I'm going to tell you what it's about, some of the architectural implementation that undergirds it, and some of the features that we'd like to see implemented in the future. Okay, so my name is Russell Wheatley. I am an open source software maintainer. I work primarily on Flutter. You may have seen me there. So Flutter, as you're probably well aware, is just a bunch of dependencies that you can pull into your Flutter application. And I also help maintain the CLI. And for the past few months, I've tapped away at Zap. And I work for a, is there a clicker? Cool. So I work for Invertase, and as you can see in the left-hand side there's some of the open source software projects that we maintain. So you have Firebase extensions, Melos, docs.page, React Native Firebase, Flutter, and then we also have a couple of closed source projects that you may be aware of. One of them is Zap, and the other one is Globe. I'm very excited about Globe. It's just a way to deploy a HTTP server in Dart very easily and think about it conceptually like Vercel. Oh, I have this. Does this work? Yes. Cool. So I think the first question that we need to answer is, what is Zap? So in a nutshell, Zap is a code sandbox for Dart and Flutter applications. And if you've done any web development, you might be aware of Code Sandbox, which allows you to run JavaScript web applications using your favorite frameworks, either React or Vue or Angular. And it's very similar to that, but with Dart and Flutter applications. So I thought I would just give a small demonstration of Zap, just for the ones who are uninitiated. Just so we're all on the same page. So this is the landing page. This just gives you a good idea of what all the features are. And if you don't have an account, you just use your GitHub account to create an account. And then you can head on over to your dashboard and you have a lovely set of projects like myself. So I thought I'd just show you what the capabilities of Zap, and then we can have a little look at some of the things that we did to achieve this aim. So, excuse me. On the left-hand side, you have the File Explorer, which you may recognize the lib folder. It's very standard in a Flutter Dart application, and that contains all your Dart source code. And then if you have a look at the bottom of the File Explorer, you'll see the pub/spec YAML, and that will contain what you'd expect, all the dependencies and all the configuration for the application. And then if you see the build folder, that is containing all the compiled code. And that compiled code is created by the custom compiler that we have running in Zap, and it creates that output. In the bottom there, you have the console, and naturally it's not actually a terminal because we don't have a file system, and it's just there to give you some feedback from any of the issues with the linting or the build rather. And then in the middle you have the code editor, and that looks very familiar maybe to a lot of you if you use VS Code, because we're actually using the Monaco code editor, which is what powers VS Code. And I just wanted to give you a little run through of the type of features that you would expect in an IDE. So for example, if I remove a couple of these keys, and then the documentation tooltip that you'd expect in an IDE, you have, of course, linting warnings, which is really nice, and then we also have autocomplete. So I just press the tab button and it completes that class instance creation. So the thing is, we actually have an analyzer running in the browser, and so that is able to communicate to the Monaco code editor using the language server protocol, or LSP for short, and it's able to give it that context, which is what we display in the browser. And then in the right-hand side, we have the preview panel. The preview panel is actually an iframe, and it's a standalone request to a server that's pulling in your application. And a little later, I'll show you how that works, but just to give you an idea of what I mean, you can simply just use that link, and if you'd like to just share it with anyone, you don't need the entirety of the Zap code editor. And of course, it does actually work, I hope. There we go, cool. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Right, so I hope you've got an idea of what Zap is, and so why Zap? Why would you even consider using it? So for us, we feel like there's a number of use cases. The first is if you're actually like a maintainer of a package or a plugin, it's really useful to have Zap embedded in your documentation, because it gives the user an idea of the use case that you're trying to illustrate. And so I can show you an example of that, because I believe Riverpod has it in its own documentation. And what's really cool about this is rather you can open it in Zap directly, and then you can start playing with it, fork it, and then add it to your own list of projects in your account. Yes, and then the next use case we believe is that it's just a really cool way to illustrate maybe a feature that you're working on or would like to have implemented, and then you can share it with your friends or your colleagues or your clients. And one of the things that I'm really fond of as a maintainer of open source software is the idea that you could actually use it to reproduce a bug very quickly. It's one of the things that I really care about, is reproductions, because I don't want to waste time trying to find a bug that may not exist. And then lastly, it is a really cool tool if you don't want to set up the Flutter and the Dart SDK. And also, of course, you'd have to set up an IDE if you really just want to get started quickly. And this is particularly relevant if you don't have a particularly powerful machine. You can just run it all in the browser, and it will just work. Okay, so now that we've got the what and the why out the way, I thought I'd give you a little peek under the hood about how it works, just a broad overview of some of the key components that make Zap work. So the first thing you may have noticed is that we had a file system in the code editor earlier that I showed you. Now naturally that isn't actually a file system. As you can imagine, there is no concept of a file system in the browser. So the way, and also of course the Flutter SDK and Dart SDK expect to be run in an environment not too dissimilar from your local dev machine. So the way we got around this was to load the file system into memory. And there's a really, really old dependency that we used. It's called browser fs, and it is conceptually allows you to use the Node.js API file system to update the in-memory file system, and then we're able to use that to compile your source code. And this is also true of the dependencies that we pull in. We just load it right into the memory file system. So having kind of, excuse my design, by the way, I'm not a designer. So when you make that, when you make changes to your code editor, so what happens is, under the hood, we create a zip file and we bundle in all your source code and the build output. If you remember, I showed you that build directory rather with all your compiled JavaScript code. So it zips all that up and then it sends it over to Google Cloud Storage. And so then when a request is made for your app, we go to, okay, yeah, so when we make this request to this URL, that will go to the Cloudflare service worker, and then that will make the request to Google Cloud Storage, and then it will literally mount the build folder onto a static HTTP server, and then it'll just serve the contents. And you can actually see in the source code in the inspector, you see this is the index file that's actually in your Zap project, and then this is the main .js file that we have in the build directory. Okay, that does not. Huh? Great. Okay, so the most challenging aspect to Zap is how we run the Dart SDK and the Flutter SDK in the browser. So I can't take any credit for this. This is actually my colleague. He's right at the back over there. His name is Mike Diarmid. And if you have any questions about this, aim them at him. So essentially we use the analyze tool and the build tool from the SDKs. And of course they're executables and they're not going to run in the browser. So what we did, we actually got those SDKs and we patched them up, and we removed all the aspects of import-output operations or environment variables, and then we bundled them into 2 separate web service workers and used that to analyze and compile your code. I'll give you an example, an overview of how that works. So you're going to have to forgive me a little bit because it is a few layers of inception. I may say compile more than I need to, but we'll get there. So the first step is to pull the Dart and Flutter SDKs from the sources before it's been built. And then we grab the Dart2.js tool and we make it work or compatible with the web. And that's the same with some of the language server protocol internals rather, for the Dart analyzer. And then once we've done that to the Dart SDK, we then compile it, and then we build an executable. And we're going to call that from here on in the custom Dart SDK. So then the next step is we then have our own Zap compiler Dart file. This also uses some aspects of the Dart SDK source code. And again, we need to also patch out the operations that aren't going to work or just break the compiler. And then ultimately we'll end up using the custom Dart SDK, run this command compile.js. As the input we'll have our Zap compiler, and then we will spit out a Zap compiler JavaScript file. And that process is also repeated for the analyzer. And then once we have those 2 separate JavaScript scripts, we then store it on a content delivery network. And once you open your Zap code editor, we will pull those 2 files and we will run them separately into service workers. And of course, the reason why we do that is we want to keep your main thread from being blocked, because we have the analyzer server running continuously, and that's why you get that instant feedback in the code editor. Okay, and one final thing I'd like to show you about some of the architectural implementation is the dependencies. So if you've ever had a look at some of the dependency sizes rather, they can be rather large. As you can imagine, with a Flutter plugin, you have source code for Android, iOS, web, Linux, Windows, and that's completely unnecessary for the application that we're trying to build, because we are building a Flutter web application. So the solution to that was for us to create our own service. We called it Zub, and it's basically a facade over pub. It's very well named. Mike gave it that name. And so it looks a little bit like this. So whenever you specify your dependencies and you build the application, we then hit our service Zub. Zub goes away to pub, and it gets the dependencies. We then strip out all the unnecessary source code, and then we also cache it and use the version as a way of caching that particular dependency. and then we send it back to the browser, which then loads it into memory along with your source code. Okay, so a few of the features that we're looking at upcoming. So you may have noticed that the dashboard was pretty bare, and so we're looking to kind of make it more useful for you as users. Of course, we'd like to, in fact, I actually have a PR for this, it's just waiting for it to be reviewed, so that hopefully should be with you sooner rather than later. The ability to pull projects into collections. So imagine again if you're like a maintainer of a plugin and you have various use cases and you want to have different Zap projects for all those use cases, then you can like pull that into, I don't know, you call it Riverpod or whatever, and then you can send the link to whoever you want with all these different various use cases. So we also would like you to have the ability to favorite projects, which is a fairly easy thing to implement. And the one thing I wanted to show you is this one. I'm not sure people are actually aware of this feature, but we actually have it at the moment, but you have to manually type it into the address bar of your browser. I can just show you a small demonstration of how that works. So we'll go to this. This is a Flutter 3D calculator, and it's basically the source code for a Flutter application. And then if I remove this, hopefully this works. It's a /, right? Yeah, cool. So yeah, so you type in zapp.run / GitHub, just removing the domain, and then you load up the application, and then you can actually see the source code has been pulled in from that repo, and it's just being imported directly into your, I can't actually move the mouse. Yes, into your Zap project. Anyway, that calculator works. We're going to ignore that build error for now. I've only just noticed that, so you know, it's a feature, not a bug. But yeah, I need to take a look at that when I get back home. So yeah, you have that ability to pull in GitHub projects, and we're going to just make that a little bit easier for you by just pasting it into some input in your dashboard. Okay, and the next thing is more of an internal change. So at the moment, like I mentioned earlier, we use the Monaco code editor, and it's a bit low level and requires a lot more implementation by us, Invertase. So we're going to integrate the VS Code web editor, which has a lot more support and a lot less implementation and maintenance for us. And then finally, probably the most requested thing is support for Dart 3, and we are working on that. And I think once this conference is over, we'll certainly have a lot more free time. We'd love to get that supported. So, okay, so thank you for listening to my talk. I appreciate the support and coming out to hear me speak. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. If you do have any questions, ask Mike. No, I'm kidding. You can ask me. If it is going to be about the analyzer and compiler, which I'm sure there's some curious folks out there, then you probably would like to ask Mike that question. So thank you for your time.